Shirley Adams for the Sewing Connection, Series 15, Program 13. Any dyeing method where a portion of fabric is squeezed to block dye penetration can be defined as tie-dye. Japanese shibori is a highly refined version of this. The earliest record of this technique began 19 centuries ago in China, but may actually have started in India. More recently, a very crude version of this was the tie-dyed t-shirts of the 60s, now making it a comeback. We'll see some beautiful examples of more refined shibori and see how you can handle the yardage if you're working with it. I'd like to show you first some that I have here on the table, and this is one very easy version. And what has happened, I didn't know exactly how it was done, and I hadn't seen it until I visited Santa Fe a while back, and I saw them doing this. Well, what they do is kind of wrinkle this fabric and see how the straight is actually like this, but then this is sort of turned, so it's kind of diagonally stretched. Well, the reason for that is because they round it around a big pipe, a big plastic one, tubing. And as they do that, as they go spiraling it around, then that's why it's pulled on the bias a little bit. And after they get it all wound that way, then I can see if I stretch this out that they did have a cord or a string or a tie of some sort, and they wrapped that around after they had all the fabric on, and it just crinkled it all in tightly. And then while it was that way, it looks like they spray painted this actually, and then when it's stretched out again, you can see that this is one very simple form of it. This is not very complicated, but this is a possibility. I've made a couple of things from these little pieces. One is this bag, and you can see I've stretched it out somewhat as I fused it to a backing. And another one, look at the model who's wearing a short vest. And this I made during the last series. You saw it there. And this vest also has some pieces of this version of it cut up and sewn here and there. So there's one type you might do. Also, when I was in Santa Fe, I saw in one of the wearable art shops this scarf that I just couldn't resist. Now I'm trying to decide what I can wear this with, but it is so beautiful and it moves, it just floats. It's very lightweight silk, as it usually is, or this type of thing would be anyway. And the colors are so varied, and if you stretch it out, you can see many, many colors in there. Well, I can see if I look at this closely after I saw how it's done, but this one was folded in 3 pieces, because here's kind of a stripe and here's kind of a stripe, the way the different wrinkles are going. And actually the origin of this is to make it look like it's raining, and it does indeed look like a driving rain coming down in various directions. Well, anyway, this was folded over, and it was folded over again, or maybe accordion folded back and forth, and then this was all wrapped around a pole, a tube, and scrunched together, and they really crunched it together down at the bottom to get these wrinkles going both ways. They are both horizontal and vertical, and so it's really pretty. I don't know what would happen to this in washing or dry cleaning, so I'll try not to get any soil on it for a good long time. But I really admire the work these dyers do. Now, the one I'm wearing has been done in Japan, and I just finished this vest recently. This is all that's down here on the table that I have left of it. That is absolutely all. There are no more scraps. So you can see that what I was trying to do is just use every bit of it to the fullest extent. So instead of using the usual vest pattern that I do, which is just made from my adjustable patterner here, instead of using this arm's eye that's here, I put on the squared off one. I wanted to use every bit of it over here, so this is why the shoulders come out, just so I wouldn't waste any of that valuable fabric. I'd like you to look at this one over here, and let's just see how these fabrics are done. Now, originally this piece would have been much bigger, but it all shrinks down as it's all tied and then dyed. And I can't even imagine all the work done in this. What they have done, if you'll look at this closely and see how it's like flowers blooming, they grow when you spread it out. What has been done here is that each one of these little points here, each one has been picked up with a pin, and it has had a thread tied around it, and then they go on and do the next one. Can you even imagine how many little ties have been done on this piece of fabric, even though it's rather small, thousands of them. I can't even imagine. Well, that would be quite time consuming, but I guess the really hairy part of it is when they untie it, because if, as they're getting all those little threads off, if they should tear the fabric in doing that, if they don't do it carefully enough, the whole big thing could be ruined. And so I'm glad someone else does that and not me. I wouldn't want to be responsible for that. But it is lovely. These are flowers, and I just have this one panel of it. I had two panels of the one I'm wearing, and so that's why I used this one for the vest. Now here's just a print fabric, and I thought that was kind of interesting when I first bought this fabric a year or two ago, but I didn't realize until after I had delved into Shibori that, oh, this is just a print. It isn't actual Shibori, but it is printed to look like it is. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Well, come back here to the ironing board with me, and I'll show you how this particular one was worked on. Now, my thought was, this is so valuable, it is so precious because so much has gone into it, and you can see the one I have here on the ironing board wasn't done in nearly as complex a manner as the one I just showed you on the table. This one has a lot less tying in it. I think it's swallows flying around, or here's one, I guess this is a swallow, it almost looks like a human figure. But what I did, first of all, you decide on which is the right and which is the wrong side. And as I look at this, I originally thought this must be the right side, but no, it is not. This is probably the right side because all those little tied places bump up, whereas if this would be the wrong side, they'd be little valleys instead of hills. So this indeed is the wrong side, which is what I want up on the ironing board. And if your ironing board isn't big enough for this, do you have some sort of a board that you could pad and just put a covering over it and use that instead, because you do need a big enough surface. Now what I'm going to do with this is stretch it out just a little bit, and not terribly much. I'm really just going to stretch it out so that I can utilize every bit of it on this. I had to stretch this one out more because I used a bigger pattern. It was both longer than the one I have on here right now, and also it was wider since it's a loose one, whereas this one's kind of fitted. So what I did first of all is just stretch, and it doesn't matter if you keep this on grain or not, because it moves around so much anyway, it doesn't matter. So all I worried about was making mine big enough to fit the pattern I had. The one that, the same thing, it was a fusible interfacing, but it just had to be stretched out big enough so that I could fit every bit of it. And it also had to be stretched down long enough so that it would go into this longer vest. So I'm just stretching this to show you the technique I used, even though I really didn't need to make this any bigger. And once you have it stretched wherever it needs to be, put a couple more pins in here, just wherever it needs to be. Those pins that you put in, keep them flat so that you can press over it. And then I would go ahead and just fuse all this down. Now I wouldn't have done this except the man I got this from said, of course, go ahead and do this. I would have thought that there's something sacrilegious about just fusing it so simply when all this work went into it. Now this vest is going to be shapeless, as is the one I'm wearing. But if I did have some shape in it, if I, for instance, had a dart here, I would go ahead and construct that dart in the interfacing. I would then fuse this over a ham so that I could get that shape in it and just fuse it that way, because I wouldn't want to fuse it flat and then put a dart in it. That would distort things. But this would work out just beautifully. Now I'm not going to fuse this because I only have one of these, and I don't know if this is what I want to use. Now of course if you just have one panel like this, but you really want to make a vest out of it, what you do is, you've been seeing all this series, is just put some other fabrics with it that seem to go really well, and the job would be done just fine that way. So I'm just going to leave this and go over to the sewing machine to show you some other things. While we're walking there, I might tell you a little bit about what I've done. After I had this fused, then it's stable. It is no longer going to shrink back into shape, and it's no longer going to change shape in any way. It will just stay as it is because it's now stable. Probably I will send this to the cleaners, even though everything in it is really washable. Just to be safe, I'll have it cleaned instead. What I've done with this one also is line it in a different color just to brighten it up a little bit. And then I also found some buttons and did some piping, and we might show how to do that if we have time. But I want to get back to something here that you've seen before. This was on a series, oh, I don't know, maybe 50 shows ago or so. But I was working with, I think, wrinkled fabric of some sort, and I was saying I had this from India. Now you can see also there are a lot of tyings here, but it's not as intricate as the cotton one I'm wearing. This one is silk, and I still haven't decided. I've decided what I'm going to make. Eventually, 2-3 series from now, you'll see it all made up. But in the meantime, I have a lot of work to do on it before I can do that, because what I have done is start this before I realized that you really could just fuse it and it'd be all right. What I had started to do is instead stitch all this to a backing, no fusible at all. So what I used for a backing is just a lightweight cotton, because I thought, well, this would make it nice and stable, and it's going to be some sort of a top, a jacket, whatever. But anyway, I thought that would be a good way to start. Since I have started stitching on this, I have no choice now but to finish the whole thing. But it isn't as though it's a job that you do all at one time necessarily. I just keep the thread with it, and every time I have a few minutes here or there, or a half hour or an hour with nothing else designated, then I might get to this and do some stitching on it. So what you want to do first, if you are going to do this, and if I had it to do again, I'm not sure I would, since it's a big piece, but I do like the little bit of glint of metallic there. I think it's pretty. It makes it dressy. It does treat it reverently, and I feel better about treating it that way than merely fusing it as I have the one I'm wearing. Well, anyway, what I did first of all is stretch it out on the table, the cotton that I have underneath. I put it all out on the table so that it was completely flat. I put this on top of it, and it stretched it out just slightly. I didn't want to stretch it out much, because you can make these flowers bloom completely by stretching it all the way out, but I like the texture of it. And so I only stretched it out far enough so that I could fit a pattern on it that I want to make it out of. Now this is a border print, so that also leaves a lot to be considered and thought through before you do it, because I have that brown border going all around the blue-purple, and I want to use it to its fullest capacity. And so I stretched it just enough. I already have laid the pattern before I took it off to make sure this is the size I want. And then you can get at, in any notions department, these curved safety pins for quilters. And probably quilt shops also sell them. And they really are nice because it's so much easier then to just pin all over. And if you'd pin with straight pins, of course, you'd have to worry about them falling out all the time, and it wouldn't be nearly as easy. But with these safety pins, I can just leave them there until I get to that section and then take them out, and everything will stay in place. Well, I can't believe it, but this is actually the middle of the fabric here. I actually have done one whole half of it, and I'm ready to start the second half as I progress down at the end. I realized that I was running out of thread late one night, and so I put a few circles, because I have this in a hoop so I can do it in circles. I did a few circles here and there and started interchanging it with a couple of other close colors in metallic threads, but so that it looks fine to be mixing it. So think about things like this. If you're going to run out of thread, and if you don't want to wait till the store opens, you might do something similar to that. Well, what this is a simple stipple stitch, and that just means going around back and forth and back and forth. And I first started, in fact, I demonstrated a little bit of this on that show when I first showed it, and I didn't at that time have a hoop on it. I just had it down on the flat fabric, and I found that's a whole lot more difficult to do. It's so much easier if you do this in a hoop, because it moves readily. Now, right now I have the free arm up. I could let the whole thing down, but if you had a flat bed, it would be easier, certainly, if you did not use a hoop. But since I have a hoop, I'll just leave it up here because it won't make any difference, really. What I also want to have on here is a darning foot, and I'm going to use, I have a metallic needle in here because I'm using metallic thread, and what they have is a bigger eye, and so I would like to have that big eye there to make the thread go in so it won't break, so it won't rub against a smaller eyed needle. So I have to work my way in here since I have a lot of fabric, but this is such thin fabric that it really doesn't matter that it's under this arm. There's plenty of room for it. Just make sure when you're doing it, because you're going to do a lot of stitching, Make sure that you don't get any of this fabric doubled under, or then you'd have a hard time ripping it all out, or at least an unpleasant time. Unsewing is not the most fun thing in the world to do, so let's make sure we just do it once. Okay, I have a straight stitch. I also need to have the feed dog down, and yes, indeed, I did not have it down. Now it's down. Okay, then we have it down, and we're ready to stitch, and the machine's telling me, are you sure you want it down? And yes, machine, I really do want it down. I usually just do a little circle like this first, so that I can kind of get the first of the thread covered up. And then after that, then I'll do a circle or circular stitching. But this is just going back and forth. And there's no way you need to do this. It doesn't matter how you do it. Just however you find it easier is going to be fine. And if you get too close to the hoop, put the needle in the down position. And then you can turn your hoop to get the back side of the foot away from it. So just work on this sort of casually. You can see this is really relaxing. This is a good thing to do one of those days when you're ready to climb the wall and you just need to unwind a little bit. This might be just the way to do it. And you also, as you're doing this, can make a decision as to, do you want little teeny stitches going back and forth, or do you want great big stitches? And usually once you get going, the best method is to stitch fast but move the hoop slowly. And in doing that, it's going to be a prettier design because you'll have a lot more stitches there. So this is the idea, and this is how you'd stitch the whole thing. What I was doing on some of them also, when I come to some of these little flowers, these little circles, instead of stitching right through, I was kind of going around them and not stitching through them. So that way it almost looks like it's padded. It almost looks like there's some trapunto there. So practice on a little corner first, or on a little part that is probably not going to be right where everybody sees it in front of your face. Make it at some far out place to get your technique perfected, because this isn't likely to give you any scraps the way you have of most fabrics before you cut them out. This is it, and so you want to make sure that you know what you're doing before you do it. And by the time you have this all done, then you just move on to put the hoop in another circle and do another area of it. And as I said, I'm alternating between 2 or 3 colors of purple then, so it's just a little bit different all over, but easy to do. In between these circles, then there's going to be a little triangle maybe that I don't get. I'll just go back and pick that up later, probably without putting it in a hoop, just on the flatbed when I have the machine pushed down in the cabinet, and then I can easily pick up the rest of it wherever I missed the first time around. So this is one way I might treat it. If I would do it again, I don't know. I might reconsider and decide that, boy, is that a lot of work. Why don't I instead just fuse it? I don't know, but at this point it is a moot point. It doesn't matter because I've already done it, so now I'm committed. I'd like to show you something else that is just so gorgeous. I accidentally ran into a very, very talented lady. I was in Santa Fe too. Now, I haven't been in Santa Fe that much. I only spent a few days there. I just seem to have mentioned Santa Fe several times this series. Actually, I teach about 50 different cities a year in seminars, so that was just one of them where I wasn't even teaching there. I was just playing and having fun. But I was in a shop and I saw this woman come in something just smashing. And I said, oh, I really love what you're wearing. Introduced myself and said, could I possibly borrow that to show on my TV series? And she said, well, certainly, you'd be welcome to, but she said, this isn't my best thing. This is just something I'm wearing. I don't remember what it was, a vest, a jacket. I believe she was just wearing it over jeans, maybe. Well, it turns out she was displaying in that wearable art shop because she sells there as well as many other places around the country. Now, she was a young woman. Her name, by the way, is Tracy Martin, and I met her way down in Santa Fe, but she's from right in my backyard, Fort Wayne, Indiana. And she looked very young, but she has credentials a mile long. She has studied with all sorts of Japanese masters of this technique, and she has won Best of Show and all sorts of other things in displays and various exhibitions all over the country. And this first jacket of hers, this short pink one, this is a really lovely version of Shibori. Now, this is a silk. Most of what she does is silk. but it is wrinkled, and yet it is stretched out somewhat, and it has been fused to a backing, and it isn't really pleated. There's some wrinkling there, but most of this, after she had it all dyed the way she wanted to, then she stretched it back out and fused it to a backing so that you can see the design a lot better in this. So there isn't that much fabric in here. She's cut it in interesting ways. Notice how the shoulder seam is not up on the shoulder, but it's way down as kind of a yoke seam. And I've told you before, you can cut seams wherever you want to. Just remember wherever you cut them to add seam allowances to each side so that you have something to sew back together. But there is also, various cords and a little bit of glint here and there, just to give it a nice rich look. And she has a different color facing in it, again, just to make the inside as pretty as the outside. Now this next one is really a prize. It is magnificent. And there are so many yards of fabric in this, you wouldn't even believe it. And yet it is practically weightless. It is very lightweight because it's a very thin silk. It's a silk charmeuse, actually. But she has just done this beautifully. If you can focus in on this real closely, you will see that that isn't just fused kind of flat, but those are really deep pleats. There is an enormous amount of yardage in there as this thin silk is pleated so much. So you can see where, I've forgotten what she told me now, like 10 yards or maybe 20 yards, but it's a lot of fabric for a jacket because it's also pleated so beautifully. Now this is not one, she has sold a lot of these things. This is not one that I think she's going to let go of. I think this is her signature jacket, so it is very valuable to her, and it is hers. I don't know if I could ever be a wearable artist who sells things because they're like children by the time you get through doing all these magnificent things. As the model moves in this, just look how it shines and shimmers and glitters, and it is a really pretty thing. I would aspire to do something like this. I've been telling you I'm going to take a painting and dyeing class, and maybe I'll do something probably not as magnificent as Tracy's, but I'll attempt it on a simpler scale. With my limited amount of ability, I will see what I can do. Well, what else I did on this vest I'm wearing that's not Shibori at all, but I only had the front panels. So the back panels I finished in a little bit different way. This is just straight fabric, the same as I've used for my pants. It's just some microfiber, actually. And what I've done is mount that on a piece of flannel, and then I did a little bit of quilting. This was an automatic quilt design that I used, and it's just putting the right memory card in and quilting it. And before I did this, I tried a couple of samples to see, do I like it better using something like this, a pearl cotton, or do I like it better if I use just regular thread? And I think I decided, I can't see the back of me now, but I think I decided to use the regular thread. And after I had that all done, notice all those little tubes that are in there. Well, I told you a few weeks ago on a tube show that there really isn't much way you can do that by machine, that you almost have to do it by hand, unless, this is how I actually did it on my jacket. I just ran a straight stitch down here, and without a straight stitch foot, I hope it'll do just with this foot that I have here. And so I just ran a straight stitch down where I wanted my stem to be. And after I had kind of a curvy stem in there, then what I did to it, and all this is doing, is securing together those two layers of fabric so that they'll work. After I had that done then, so that they would hold together, I did do some piping. And that piping then is cut off so that it's very short. Let me find a piece here. Here's a little piece. That's cut off so that it's very short because I wanted very little seam allowance here. So it's cut down to the nubs. Maybe about 1/8 of an inch is all I had. And then with that cut, what I have done to it is put that right up next to my stitching line here. And I then could fold it and pin it so that the seam allowance only would be within. And then after I had this pinned, you can see this takes enough work that after I got all this finished, I thought, you know, that might have been just as fast to do it all by hand. And maybe that would have been the easiest technique after all. But this is how I actually did it all by machine. Once it's all pinned in there, and I pinned a lot of those rows all at once, and then turned it over to the back side. And as I stitched it, when I'd come up to the pin, I'd take it out so that I would be on exactly the same line. So it can be done by machine if you have piping like this. If you have a rounded tube like this, then of course you'd put it on by hand. What I also have put on by hand, though, is use these tubes for the front buttonholes. And here the buttons just sort of prompted that. A combination of the buttons and the lining fabric that they're made out of prompted this, because it had stripes in it anyway, and because the buttons were square, I thought, let's just square off those buttonholes. And so they are put on by hand. And just make sure where all the openings are, that square part of it, just make sure that the button fits through just as it should, and so everything will work out just fine. And I kind of like the interplay of the piping here and the tube with the buttonhole going there. Well, I have developed a little bit more courage to do something that varies from what I usually do. So I've loosened up by associating this year with all these quilters and wearable artists, and it's a lot of fun to do these things. Well, we've just finished Series 15. I realize that ended show number 195 of the Sewing Connection that I've done so far. Well, am I running out of ideas? No, and I never will. There are so many exciting things happening everywhere, and I'm ready to go find them. Everything is not for everyone, so you sort out what does appeal to you and what will make your life a little happier, and make up some of these things I've been showing you, because you really can do it. Tell your station manager that we two, you and I, really are a team by now, and be sure they air Series 16 coming up soon. I'm Shirley Adams for the Sewing Connection, looking forward to the next time. Until then, enjoy.